Well, this is a real privilege for me. Ian Kerner, thank you so much for coming on the show.
My pleasure, Ben. I'm really excited.
So you've written 2 books, you've done all sorts of podcasts and radio shows and you name it, and you've been in the space around sexual health and individual psychotherapy as well for a while. So you've dealt with people on an individual and a couple level.
Absolutely.
Throughout your time, what has surprised you most?
What does tend to surprise me? I think one of the things that surprises me is how essential the expression of sexuality is to our lives and relationships. And, in a world where people care so much about health and fitness and mental health and productivity and self-optimization, how often this topic is neglected in one's life, and how a couple can be lying right next to each other, inches apart, and really feel thousands of miles apart, living lives of quiet desperation. So sex has always been an incredibly important area to me. It's always been a part of my life and my relationships that has always made me feel most alive. And I think it's why I love doing this work. And it is surprising the extent to which people will neglect this topic or deprioritize the importance of sex. I work with a lot of millennials, young people in their late 20s and 30s and mid 30s who are picking their life partners, their spouses, the people they want to have kids with and share their lives with. And of course, they're coming to see me. So clearly something must be up. Not all is ideal. And I'm always astounded that couples aren't picking each other very often with sexual attraction as a real priority. It's not the first most important thing, and sometimes it's not the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, or 10th most important thing. And so it surprises me the way something that's so important and so essential can be so neglected and so deprioritized.
Would you say sexual attraction or sexual compatibility should be in the top 3 things couples should prioritize for when choosing a long-term mate?
Yeah, I really do. I think it should be certainly in the top 3. I don't know exactly how we, slice
Yeah.
everything up, but I know most of us go into long-term relationships wanting to be monogamous, wanting to find someone we can really grow and deepen with. And unless, we just want like a best friend or a roommate or a travel buddy, I don't know why we wouldn't be prioritizing sexual chemistry. I mean, I would say that was the first thing that attracted me to my wife, was my attraction to her and the desire and the chemistry. And yeah, a lot came from there, and she turned out to be a great, well-rounded person. But that sexual thread has been a real glue in our relationship. I don't think we would have made it through all of the hurdles and complexities and difficulties and milestones of the life cycle without having a strong sexual chemistry and relationship.
It becomes glaringly obvious when you're in a relationship and if there's a sexual issue that comes up and it doesn't get resolved quickly, it sort of consumes your thoughts and it becomes very hard to turn off, and it becomes a big problem really quickly. So I completely agree why it's bizarre it doesn't get enough attention. Although I think more so these days, right? I think it's from the beginning of your career to now, I imagine you have more conversations and it's an easier world to talk about this kind of stuff.
Yeah, it is. It's also though really interesting if you told somebody, if I said to you, what's the most important quality in picking a partner? And I said, oh, someone who really values me, or we share the same values, or we are best friends, or we have each other's backs. You wouldn't think twice, you wouldn't question it. But if I said, yeah, the most important quality was my sexual interest, attraction, and ability to have a great sex life, you'd probably think I was a very shallow dude.
Well, yeah, well, it's an interesting, it's definitely an interesting metric, or I don't know, criteria. I wonder what the difference between people in the US and us prude Brits over here, all sort of awkward and repressed. Um, but I think it's an important thing. I think it's an important thing. When you see, we start with the males. I feel like they're more, perhaps more of an issue. Who knows? But when males come to see you, what is the biggest problem or complaint they come and talk to you about?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, if we're looking at men who are in partnered relationships, one of the biggest complaints might be uh, feeling like their sex drive or their sexual interest exceeds their partners, or their sexual personality is more adventurous or more expansive. So it's often about bridging some sort of discrepancy, either around the frequency of sex or the quality of sex. I would think the second thing that I deal with the most in men um, is anxiety related to sex that leads to impairment in erectile function or causes erectile unpredictability. I would say that that is, if we're just looking at sexual problems that men experience, I would say uh, erectile unpredictability related to
Yeah.
performance anxiety.
Loads to go off. I thought when I was talking to my friends saying, oh, I've got Ian Kerner coming on. I know you've read the book. I know you've read his book. She Comes First. What would be your what do you want? What do you want me to ask him? And the number one thing from my male friends was that desired discrepancy in a relationship, which I thought was interesting because I think it was probably about 6 or 7 friends, and all of them said the same thing. Um, so
Yeah.
it's a common problem. Um, and then the second thing they come to speak to you about. Do you think that's because males have to unlearn that sex isn't performance? It's not something to try to optimize or have I got that wrong?
Uh, no, I think that men are very performance driven. I think that men are very comparative and competitive. I think most of us grow up in what I would call sex avoidant homes, so we're not talking about sex. Sex isn't being modeled. We're not learning much about sex. We're probably very excited to become sexual and have sex. And then I think we're sort of, before we know it, we're sort of like standing on the high diving board, jumping into the pool of sex, and we realize we don't know a single thing about sex. And so I think it's easy to feel anxious. I think anxiety can very, very quickly redirect blood away from the genitals towards the hands and feet in a kind of fight or flight panic mode. And then I think once you start to have that initial experience, you start to worry about it, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I think many of the men that I work with who have that kind of performance anxiety, it's often around intercourse specifically. And I think that men have a lot of internalized beliefs around sex. Their penises are supposed to function in a certain way. They're supposed to be a certain size. They're supposed to be able to last, a certain amount of time. And so I think that men just come in incredibly pressured and stressed, especially around intercourse. And I think that they feel that, sex is supposed to be super spontaneous. You shouldn't have to talk about it. You should just be able to do it. And so I think that we're setting up a lot of challenges for ourselves.
Mm. Well, I guess the lack of sexual education or lack of conversation in I guess the houses where it's not something you talk about, most of the time it's just results to porn, and that is a sexual education. I don't think it's not the real world. Um, which I can there's all sorts of downstream issues with that. Top two problems then for males. How would you go about working with someone on that? Maybe if we started with that desired discrepancy.
Yeah. Well, I think, certainly if we're looking at heterosexual relationships, men and women tend to fall into different desire frameworks, as I would say. Men tend to fall into what we might call a spontaneous desire framework or a highly reactive desire framework. Men can respond quite viscerally and immediately to sexual cues. For example, if my wife is walking out of the shower and she's like looking particularly cute in her towel, like I will see that and I will notice that she is sexy, and that noticing will very much metabolize in my body, and I will have an urge to have sex. So I think a sexual cue often equals sexual arousal. I mean, meanwhile, if I'm coming out of the shower, I think, my wife may say, oh, that's a sort of a cute guy over there, or that's a sexy guy over there. But it just doesn't metabolize in her body in the same way. It doesn't lead to that urge to have sex. And I think that this can be really confusing for men and
Mm,
really confusing and frustrating for women. I think we really operate in a different desire framework. For a guy, we can pivot very quickly into a desire to have sex. And I think that women are not in that spontaneous desire framework. They're more in what we would call a responsive desire framework, where desire really needs to emerge. Arousal really needs to percolate and simmer in some way. So I think a lot of men will get frustrated and they'll say, geez, why am I always the one to initiate? Why do I always have to get things going? Why can't I be wanted? I want to be wanted in the same way that I want. And of course, I think the male way of experiencing desire, this kind of reactive or spontaneous framework, is what really gets reinforced in the media. It's what we see. It's what gets reinforced in porn. And so I think a lot of women also end up feeling broken or saying sort of like, what's wrong with me? Like, why don't I feel desire in that way? Or, oh, I remember feeling that in the very beginning of the relationship. Something must be wrong with me that I don't feel it that way anymore. So I think this discrepancy isn't about one person being high desire and the other person being low desire. I think it's about just different ways to get to desire and not really communicating through it.
the when you're talking about the desired, I guess, discrepancy, and males being very, as you say, metabolize that desire very quickly, and it's very impulsive. Whether it's different for all guys. I've spoken to some people or some females in middle age who start taking testosterone cream. And
Mhm.
before, I was speaking to a lady who, before, she said, I never got it. That whole like male desire thing. They're just staring at you when you come out the shower, just like, stop being a creep for 1 second, please. And then after she started taking testosterone cream, she said, "Oh no, I get it. I get it now. I'm that
Right.
I'm that guy. I'm that person," which I thought was very interesting. It might be too overly simplistic to put it all on testosterone, but still, kind of
Well, no, I
kind
think
of good.
testosterone is a variable. I've worked with trans men who have transitioned from being female bodied to being male bodied, and they go on testosterone, and that's one of the first things that they will notice is that kind of spontaneous desire. So I think testosterone certainly does play a role. But again, I don't think we need to live in a world where women need to take testosterone in order to show up for sex in the way they believe they should be or their male partners want them to be. I think we should be working together to just cultivate very sexy sexual lives together where it's somewhat easier to access that desire.
Mm. So on the arousal piece, if a guy, or you're working with a male in a working with a male in a heterosexual relationship, and there's this desire discrepancy. He wants a little bit more than she does, and you walk them through this framework of like, okay, your desire works differently to the female, right? You
Well, hey,
see and you respond. Maybe an analogy, I think I've heard you talk about it before, but it's like boiling a kettle. You got to put it on the heat, and you've got to wait a little bit. It takes a bit of time. You got to build it up. How do how does a man um react, or how does a man show up in a way that allows enough time to, I guess, get the kettle bubbling without scheduling and taking the romance out, or the sexiness out of sex?
well, can I ask you, Ben, why does scheduling or allocating time necessarily take the romance out of sex? I mean, we all lead very busy lives. We will all schedule. I mean, we've scheduled this podcast. I've scheduled appointments all day for things that are much less important to me than sex. Why wouldn't I? We could use the word schedule, or I could just say make time or make space for sex. Why does that mean then that the sex is less romantic? Because I'm not getting struck by some bolt of lightning that's just, compelling my wife and I to run into each other's arms. So that would be the first thing I'd say is, what's wrong with scheduling sex? I mean, I'll schedule a dentist appointment. Why wouldn't I schedule sex? Having sex is much better than going to the dentist.
It is. I completely agree. I mean, I'm gonna push you on that point. I don't know if it is I agree with the point, and I think it's if you don't make time for things that are important, they will. Life goes on, right? Life will get in the way. Um, However, in my research, I have when you schedule sex from the female side, apparently often it can take the romance out of it, and I don't think it should. Part of I guess my understanding of desire is anticipation as well. And when you can schedule, that anticipation can build, at least in my experience. So yeah, I don't know why it should, but I feel the social script, or I guess the consensus view is, when you schedule sex, you take the fun out of it. So how do you work with couples who maybe have that, I guess, knee-jerk reaction
Yeah.
to a suggestion of making time for it?
Well, you know, there was a study done that showed that couples who had sex once a week had higher levels of relationship positivity than couples who did not have sex once a week. The couples who had sex 2, 3, 4, 5 times a week did not necessarily have higher levels of relationship positivity than the couples who had sex once a week, but the couples who had sex less than once a week had lower levels of relationship positivity. So the first thing I want to say is that I think that sex is an important part of having a relationship, that it contributes to overall relationship positivity. And I think having sex once a week for a lot of couples resonates as something that's worth striving for on a regular basis. So I think that we should be looking to make a ritual out of sex, at least a once a week ritual where we are really prioritizing trying to have great, healthy sex together as part of having a great, healthy relationship. So I will often ask couples to, when are you most likely to be able to make time to have, a healthy, fun, pleasurable sexual experience? And let's just say it happens to be a weekend evening, like a Saturday night, let's just say. So I will ask couples, make time to have sex on that Saturday evening. And when you wake up that morning, live that day knowing that you want to get to Saturday evening. I'm not telling you to change your whole life, but wake up and be nice to each other, and take care of yourself in a way that's going to help you to show up that evening. If it means, going to the gym, taking care of yourself in a certain way, eating right, collaborating together on chores, not arguing or working to get out of an argument in a healthy way. Plan something that's going to be fun and distracting and sexy. get yourself disinhibited in whatever way you need to get yourself disinhibited, and make time to come home and to be sexual with each other. Now, we can talk about the quality of sex and what is a couple's ability to engage together physically, sexually, physically, psychologically, to become absorbed in a sexual event that's going to be fun and pleasurable, but to basically start to make this a ritual in your life. And then when you're not having sex, I think a lot of people will eliminate sexiness from their life. They will eliminate eroticism. They will eliminate flirtation from their lives because they feel like, oh, that's going to be construed by my partner as a request, a demand, an invitation to have sex. And so they end up sort of pushing their sexual selves out of the room of their lives unless they are actively going to be having sex. And I think that that's a big mistake too. I talk a lot about the erotic thread or the connecting tissue between sexual events. You don't have to have sex to be sexual with each other, to be sexy with each other, to create that kind of anticipation. So I work a lot with couples and sort of scaffolding, bringing sex back into their lives in a way that's integrated with the rest of their lives, which I think is just something that most couples in the hubbub of their lives have not figured out how to do.
Mm. I think it's, I mean, what really well put. Just one more on the male side of the coin, and then we'll go to the females, and then maybe
Sure.
go off a little tangent. But how can males normalize in a heterosexual relationship, normalize more foreplay if they suddenly get in a relationship where their partner, their female partner, maybe has an established dynamic of, well, foreplay is not a thing. Let's just go straight to penetration.
Yeah, I think that that's a big issue. I mean, we talked about men and performance anxiety. And if you look at heterosexual couples and you ask them about the last time they had sex, and I wrote a whole book that's called So Tell Me About the Last Time You Had Sex, where that's a question I ask couples in my practice because I really want to hear about how they structure a sexual event. And if I'm working with heterosexual couples and I ask them about the last time they had sex, 95 to 100% will say, well, we had intercourse or we tried to have intercourse. And if we didn't end up having intercourse, it's because we failed to get there. And when you ask heterosexual couples, how long did it take you to get to intercourse? The vast majority of couples will tell me 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes, 7 minutes, 10 minutes tops, usually. And so that just shows the extent to which intercourse is really being privileged as the most important behavior, the most important sexual behavior in terms of structuring a sexual event. There was a study of gay men. I think it was a study of 10,000 gay men, and the last time they had sex, and only 30% or 33% engaged in intercourse the last time they had sex. The other 60% were engaging in outer course, or what we might consider to be foreplay, and they were structuring very sort of multifaceted sexual events that were not at all intercourse dependent. So I think it is really important for couples to work to get out of what I call sort of that intercourse discourse, because I think it creates a lot of pressure. It puts a lot of pressure on men with very little arousal to show up with, really robust erections. And we also know that for women that the clitoris is the powerhouse of the female orgasm, and that the vast majority of sensitive nerve endings that contribute to female pleasure are located on the surface of the vulva and not inside the vagina. So I think it would behoove both men and women to sort of get out from under what I call the intercourse discourse and start creating sexual events that are much more outer course focused.
Mm. That's really,
Did
really
that answer the question? I mean,
100%.
you
Yeah.
know, yeah, okay, okay.
Yeah, for sure it did. I mean, I think it's really, um, it's really nice to hear that, this is something that both sides of the couple can need to work on. It's not just a given. Um, it's not a given that foreplay will just always be a thing, and actually, often it takes time to sort of establish a new dynamic between two people who've just got together, right? Um, on the performance side for males, how do you work with someone who's got some sort of performance anxiety that's affecting them physically?
Um, well, first I want to establish that the problem itself may be anxiety based and that, the problem itself is causing some anxiety that's creating panic, and that panic is triggering adrenaline, and that adrenaline is leading to a sort of fight or flight response in which blood is being directed away from the penis and into the hands and into the feet. And so, um, I'll want to talk about it as an anxiety issue, and how do we create sexual events that are more anxiety free. And certainly, in the case of erectile dysfunction or erectile unpredictability, using a medication can be one part of a solution. But then, just how do we create sexual events that have that arousal runway? I mean, to me, if you were to ask me, what is sex, or what is good sex, or what is a good sexual event, I would say that sex is a process of mutual absorption. It's becoming absorbed, it's getting into flow with each other, it's turning off our thinking brains and really getting into our bodies. And to become absorbed like that, we really need to think about what is the arousal runway that we're creating with our partners to really become absorbed in a sexual event. So um, I will work with men on how they can best get absorbed in sex. Now, the other sexual issue that I deal with a lot is early ejaculation, which is a really common sexual problem, which is not based in anxiety. So that if it really depends on what is the issue, what is the sexual problem that we are looking at, and
Mm.
what's the best way to handle it.
Yeah, sure, sure. I think it's another one of those ones where it's probably got uh, more common to talk about these things. I mean, I think 20, 30 years ago, if no guys would be talking about this. But actually, the more you know other people have gone through the same thing, it probably lessens the anxiety of actually this is normal. You don't feel something's not happening. You're not feeling yourself. All good. It's just a one-off. But I think if it's, oh my God, what's wrong with me? I'm not a man. I'm not this. It can amplify the effects, perhaps. We're going to the female side. What do you hear females come to you most with?
Well, I definitely hear women coming to me also complaining about this, desire discrepancy, or wanting to understand it better, or wanting to be in relationships where their male partners can better understand how desire works for them and take a kind of a less impulsive, less reactive approach to sex. um, I certainly hear from women about the difficulties becoming aroused, becoming absorbed in sex, the difficulties turning off the thinking brain. I think a lot of women show up and will engage in sex, but feel sort of disconnected or dissociated from the sexual event. They're not fully absorbed in the sexual arousal process. I think a lot of women will complain that the sex that they're having either doesn't generate arousal, it doesn't lead to orgasm, or it can be painful. Yeah, I think that those are some of the main issues that I hear about from women when it comes to just the sex itself.
Okay, fine, fine. So I guess working with a couple, and when the female side of the equation comes up, it's sort of gently not completely destroying the male ego, which I've learned is a very fragile thing, which I'm sure makes you very skilled at your job, right?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Can you repeat that, Ben?
Oh, just I was just saying that must be quite hard to sort of gently let the male ego down, um, which I don't envy that. That must be quite hard. When it comes to communication between couples, in a long-term relationship, you've been together, I don't know, a number of years, and you've seen each other's flaws. You've been very vulnerable with each other outside of sex. How can you how do you work with people to get sexual confidence back with a partner who's seen all their flaws?
Well, when you say seen all their flaws, are you saying that, you're working with a couple per se and sex hasn't been working or they feel somewhat disconnected? And how do we create an environment where we can sort of suspend our disbelief or suspend our preconceptions and sort of, um, you know, get back in there and give things another whirl and sort of start
Yeah,
over again with each
yeah,
other?
yeah, for sure. I guess you've got years of, um, seeing someone at their not lowest, but seeing somewhere at their most human, their most vulnerable, their most unsexy. Doing the dishes or this. How can you build that sort of sexual confidence back?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think one thing that you're talking about, which is interesting, is that long-term relationships are based on, responsibility, predictability, dependability. There's an intimacy and, seeing each other every day, not at our sexiest selves. I mean, I think it's important, as I said earlier, to create space for sex. I think it's important to hold on to our desires, to be attractive for each other. Like speaking personally, there was a time where I think in my own relationship with my wife where we went from sort of sexy lingerie to, sort of thermal chicken pajamas, which were, not their sexiest. And I think my wife would have said something to me like, well, why do I have to show up in, sexy lingerie for you? You should be able to accept my chicken thermal pajamas. And yes, I can totally accept the chicken thermal pajamas, but I think we have to continue to honor our sexy selves as well. I think we need to continue to try and remain attractive to each other. I think we need to show up feeling good and feeling sexy and wanting to still bring that out in ourselves and in our partners. I think it's important to be able to talk about sex. It's important to be able to say to our partners, I had a super sexy dream about you last night, and
Mm,
this is what we were doing, and this is what turned me on. I think it's
mm,
important to be able to engage our sexual imaginations with each other. I think it's important to be able to, share our turn ons. And so I think a lot of couples have neglected that, or they never found the language to even engage in those conversations. And so I think that that's what I'm able to do in my office is just get people talking, get their sexual selves talking to each other.
yeah. I often find in my relationships, I'm way more willing to talk about sex with my partner who produces this podcast. She's going to a nice little nugget for her mentioning this if she see if she listens to it all the way through. Um, I often find I want to talk about sex outside of being sexual way more than she does. And when I do, it's like, oh, stop. Just like, can you think about something else for like a second, please? You're like a dog. Okay, just ease off.
Yeah, but I see the opposite a lot though, Ben, where couples are having sex, but people aren't feeling desired in their relationships. And so sex has sort of become this sort of, functional space where they can have sex. But I hear from a lot of women, um, I want to feel desired by my partner. I want to feel objectified by my partner. And a lot of men, especially, I think, don't always know how to enter into that language or enter into that space of kind of healthy objectification. It's funny, sometimes I'll be at a restaurant, and I'll be sitting next to a couple, and the way they can talk about food, oh, look at this on the menu, or this is so delicious, try this, it's so succulent, you have to take this right out of my hand, right out of my spoon, Um, if we could just sort of get into that language with each other, it would be so much richer.
Mm,
I think so much of sex is not about the sex itself. It's about making each other feel wanted and desired.
mm. But if you get two people who, let's say, you use the term, what term did you use earlier? I think it was sex positive household growing up versus someone who wasn't in the sex positive household growing up. And those two, fall in love, get together, and then, they're actually working on their sex life. They're trying to, it's something to, like a shared page that they, I don't know, both of them got brushes and they're both painting on it. It's wonderful. And it's this exploration. But yet you're trying to normalize that talking outside of the sexual experience. I imagine it's hard for the person who's grown up in a non-sexual household, and it becomes easier to someone. So I imagine you must get that discrepancy a lot of someone. It's like, oh, we shouldn't talk about this. This is awkward. Another, it's, yeah, let's do it. It turns me on. I love the anticipation. Let's go. Must be
Yeah.
hard.
Yeah, well, I find that, certainly at least in here in the States, that for many individuals and couples, sex tends to just be a sequence of physical behaviors. And there isn't much space for psychological arousal, for, the discussion of fantasy or erotic themes or language that's particularly sexual. So I part of my work is helping couples really discover and incorporate that psychological arousal into their lives and into their sex lives. And sometimes that can be face to face in a way, like let's start talking about our fantasies with each other and our turn-ons. But a lot of couples, especially if you grow up in a kind of sex avoidant environment, which so much of us have, I feel like we need to take a more side by side approach as opposed to a face to face approach. So what does that look like? It could look like being able to read sexy erotica aloud together. It can be listening to erotica podcasts. It can be watching sexy shows or watching ethical porn together. It can be um, going out together and going to a sex toy store and buying something, or going to a lingerie store and picking out something that's going to be sexy. So I do try and help couples to have sort of side by side sexy experiences that have psychological arousal in them. And then to maybe, once you've sort of developed that kind of side by side approach, to move a little more face to face, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. So sort of, if I got you right, the partner who is slightly more comfortable talking about sex, don't slam on the gas out. Maybe do it. There's an oblique way. There's sort of a side door to sort of gently build it up over time. As you said, like the sort of the side by side thing resonated lots, as opposed to this sort of intense direct conversation or experience. Okay, that's really interesting. The You must hear a lot of really bad advice that gets touted around for couples when it comes to their sex life. What really bad advice do you hear that you think people should just ignore?
I think this idea of and anything that promotes the idea that sex is supposed to be something that's really spontaneous, something that's unplanned, something that should just, you know, really just happen without any communication. I think the idea of always adding novelty and newness into our sex lives. I mean, I think in some ways, the couples who have great sex lives often um, they have a sense of the choreography of the dance. I also call this the sex script. You know, what is
Mm.
the sequence of behaviors that you tend to engage in that create a sexual event? And the idea that well, we shouldn't fall into a pattern of having, a sex script, that sex should always be new and novel. I think in fact, good sex is often a dance where we're not going to a dance class trying to learn new steps. It's a choreography that we understand about each other, and we know how to dance with each other, and we don't always have to be thinking about, like, oh, what are the new steps, what's the new dance, or we've learned how to tango, now let's go, learn, some sort of salsa dancing. No, I mean, I think that good sex is really having over time developed a choreography that we don't have to think about. It's kind of automatic. It's
Yeah.
just we just sort of know how to drop into that dance with each other. And yes, on top of that, we could add some fantasy. We can add some conversation. We could add some a different position or a departure. But I think fundamentally, we shouldn't have to always be learning something new.
Mm.
Because if we're learning something new, then we're not really just allowing ourselves to let go and become absorbed, if that makes sense.
It does. It does. And I imagine if you don't allow yourself to let go and become absorbed, that the infamous orgasm gap probably gets wider and wider and wider. Um, so all these things you're suggesting probably help close that gap even further. Like having ample time. If you create the time, you've got enough time to really let both arousals get to the point where magic
Yeah.
can happen, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you talk about the orgasm gap, what you're really talking about is how, especially in heterosexual relationships, the vast majority of men are able to experience orgasm, and the vast majority of women are not able to necessarily experience orgasm. So there's a gap happening between the male and the female orgasm when it comes to heterosexual scripts, heterosexual sex. And I think that the orgasm gap happens for two reasons. One, that so many sexual events are, as we said, are intercourse focused and do not provide ample clitoral stimulation. And so there's an orgasm gap because women aren't receiving the kind of arousal and pleasure that leads to their orgasms. And I think the other orgasm part of the orgasm gap is, as you said, is it's it's an arousal discrepancy, that men are becoming very aroused and very engaged and are able to move through the process of arousal, you know, uh, very quite quickly, and that women are often getting left behind.
Mm. Yes. With I feel like with what to do, it's usually pretty clear and it usually is easy to digest, but sometimes I find it easier if you flip it and reverse and invert it. So rather than ask, as we've covered what males should do, what females can do to sort of get to a better place sexually. My question to you is, if you were to write a list for a couple of things to do to really mess up their sex life, what would it be?
What would it be? It would be certainly uh, rushing to intercourse would uh, mess things up. Yeah, not giving yourself time to simmer and percolate. It would be modeling sex against, porn. It would be focusing on how easy it was in the first 6 months of the relationship or the first year of the relationship before your lives were filled with complexity and stressors and different kinds of, all different kinds of responsibilities, trying to uh, think what else. Those are a few things that come to mind, though.
That's great. Okay, we got a list to avoid now. That's helpful, practical takeaways there. Um, yeah, it's definitely it's an area of, what do you want to call it, health or sort of personal growth, that it makes up such a large portion of your life, as we alluded to earlier. One of my favorite books is a book by Will Durant, called Fallen Leaves, and he's long dead now, but in it he has a chapter on sex, and he says, with men, too much can ruin a good man because you just obsessively focus on sex, but too little is just a tragedy, because he says, quote, it's the very essence of life. And he's right, it is, reproductively. And I always like that. And it's really nice sort of framework, I find, where it's like it's like salt, not too much, not too little.
Yeah, well,
we,
it also makes me think just quickly that, when we think about eroticism, we think about the word eros, and eros is really about energy and life force. And so I think the relationship between our life force, our energy, and our eroticism, I think it's all inextricably kind of bound together. But I think ultimately, sex and sexual energy are really a vital part of our life force.
yeah, I agree. I think you feel good in yourself if you've got that sort of sexual energy, right? It's you feel like your best self. I think, at least in my experience. How can you keep that easy? I'm 28, right? My hormones are good, all this kind of stuff. How can you keep that sexual energy as you get older?
Well, I think that certainly lifestyle and diet and diet and exercise play a big role. I think that our sense of self-esteem ties so directly into our sense of our sexuality. So I think, um, if I'm thinking about people who still feel good in their bodies, still have energy and stamina, I think about being in relationships where we're really keeping sexuality alive. I mean, I've been married for 25 years now, and certainly time changes the body, time changes our drive, but ultimately, being in a loving, connected relationship where sexuality has always been a consistent part of the relationship, and celebrating our attraction to each other, and just continuing to lead lives where we're not, bogged down in parenting and bogged down